Hi, I'm Kirk Hansen, Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. In my role at NNRG, I travel all across the Northwest and visit lots of different forests and meet with lots of different forest owners who are all managing their forests for a wide range of objectives. A central feature of my job is to evaluate the forest conditions for a forest owner and help make management recommendations for how they can match up the ecological characteristics of their forest with their management objectives. Today I'm here in my family's forest near Oakville, Washington, and I want to share with you some of the steps that I go through to conduct what's called a forest stand assessment. The first point that I want to make, though, is that I find it incredibly important when coming into a new forest to enter it as objectively as possible and just make qualitative observations about the forest. I think there's a tendency to jump straight into making management decisions such as, boy, this forest really needs to be thinned. But does it? Management recommendations are always the confluence of the ecological characteristics of a forest and a landowner's management objectives. So before we even get to the point of making any kind of management recommendations, we first have to evaluate what's going on in that forest. And I think that requires objective observation initially. So when I first come into a forest, I like to just relax, take the pressure off, and just make observations. Essentially, just go for a walk and take notes on what I'm seeing. If I can divorce myself from my ego and just open up to what's happening around me, I think that allows the natural process of revelation to take place, and we gain deeper insights into what's happening in forest ecology. So I want to go through a series of steps for making a forest stand assessment. And I'd like to admit that, or I'd like to say that, I have a very systematic process for doing this. But to be honest, my process probably is more the observational equivalent of free association. I just like to go for a walk and see what I see and allow the forest to reveal its own mysteries to me. But for the purpose of this video, I want to take you through a couple steps and show you some variables that you can pay attention to when you're making a forest stand assessment. One of the first things that seems really obvious to me when I come into a forest is just the overall species composition. Is this forest dominated by hardwoods, or is it dominated by conifers, or is it a mix of the two? I like to look around and see, well, what's the general stocking of the forest? What's the density? Does this forest seem like it has a lot of trees in it that are packed in very close together? Or is the composition more open, a few bigger trees? Or again, maybe a mix of the two. You've got a combination of small trees, large trees, young trees, old trees, which brings me to age. Now, it might be hard to determine exactly what the age is of a forest if you don't already have familiarity with it, but we can lump that age into some really basic categories. Are the trees young? Are the trees mid-aged? Or is the forest comprised of a few large older trees? Or again, a mix of all of those together? Part of the composition is it very heterogeneous or is it very homogeneous? Heterogeneous is that it has lots of different species, lots of different ages. There's a very complex structure to it. Homogeneous, it's more like a simplified plantation, single species, single age. The other thing I like to look at is the forest canopy. I look up and look at where the crowns of the individual trees occupy space within the canopy. I look at the strata. In other words, where do those trees fall in the horizontal layering of the forest canopy? Is it complex or is it simplified? I start looking at the individual tree crowns in something called the live crown ratio. How much of the tree is in live green crown? I look at the crown placement of the individual trees. Where does that tree exist within the canopy? Are those crowns very compressed and are they competing in the canopy? Or are the crowns very broad and they have plenty of space to grow? I also look at storm damage. Especially in young stands, oftentimes you look up and you see that the trees are broken off at a particular point. There's some other kind of damage in the canopy. This leads me to also then look at timber quality. Are the trees nice and straight? Are they limb free? Or do they have a lot of sweep to them? Is there some damage on the trunk or in the crown? Is there some other kind of obvious defect that looks like it would diminish timber quality? Again, you don't have to be able to understand or have a knowledge of timber quality to be able to make an observation of whether a tree looks like it's nice and straight and clean or if it has some kind of defect. Also look at forest health conditions. Do I see a lot of dead trees in the forest? Are there groups of dead trees? Looking up again at the crowns of the trees, I look at the needles or the leaves. Have the leaves fallen off some of the trees early in the season? Do the needles on the conifers look like they're pale or they're beginning to get very thin and sparse so you can see right through the crown to the sky above? Is there pitch weeping out of the base of a tree? Are there little holes in the tree with sawdust coming out that might give me some clue that there's an insect infestation in that tree or at the stand level? Is a tree putting on a lot of cones or a lot of seed? These things might indicate stress within the forest. Are there invasive species, Himalayan blackberry, Scotch broom, etc., that are present in the forest? The other thing that I look at is the understory vegetation. As I look around the forest, is there a wide diversity of understory shrubs and ground covers? Or is the understory layer dominated by just 1, 2, or 3 species? I look at the light that's coming through the canopy. If you have a dense canopy, sometimes the understory is going to be very shady. If the canopy is more open or it's a hardwood canopy and more porous, the understory might be very light. And I might notice a relationship between the light in the forest and understory species or understory diversity. I may look off in the distance and see a gap in the canopy and sunlight coming through that gap. And on the forest floor, I notice a patch of much higher diversity and abundance of understory shrubs. I'll look around and see if I can observe mushrooms. Is there a high diversity of mushrooms coming up on the forest floor or coming out of growing on some of the trees? If they're growing on the trees, that might also be a forest health note that I want to make. Do I notice lichen growing in the crowns of the trees or moss growing on the branches of the trees? These give me some more points of biological diversity other than just the vegetation. I'm also going to make some observations about wildlife, wildlife habitat, wildlife structure. Are there large dead trees, snags, that have obvious signs of bird use or small mammals that are occupying cavities in those trees? Are there large down logs on the forest floor? As I look around at the shrub layer, is it obvious that there are shrubs that are producing berries and nuts that provide forage for birds and small mammals? I'll look for any signs of browse from deer or elk. Maybe there's wildlife trails going through the forest. They give me some kind of clue as to what kind of wildlife species are occupying the forest. The other thing to look at is the aspect of the topography. Is the landscape sloping, maybe facing south? Does it feel a little warmer? Is it facing north, or is it maybe down in some kind of ravine? It feels cooler. Is the topography steep? Is it flat? Is it undulating? The last thing I'll take a look at are the soils. And as I go for my walk, I'm always trying to pay attention if there's any place where soils are exposed. For instance, this road cut right here is a perfect place to take a look at the different soil horizons, and it reveals to me that in this particular location, these soils are comprised of clay. But it might reveal gravel, it might be bedrock. Maybe as I walk around, I see some rock outcrops that give me an idea of what the parent material is beneath the soil. So these are just some of the observations that I make during a stand assessment. Again, they're all qualitative, and by no means are they exhaustive, but what they should do is give you kind of a thought process for how you enter a forest and begin making these observations and taking notes on what you're seeing. What we're going to do next is go from a stand level assessment down to more of a quantitative assessment. We actually start measuring some of the trees, and that will add a finer point to our forest stand assessment.